I never thought my son would choose a woman he'd known for 8 months over the mother who raised him for 32 years. But there I stood in the garden of our family ranch, wearing my mother's blue dress, being told to leave my own son's wedding. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 59 years old, and I've spent the last 15 years keeping this Montana ranch alive after my husband James passed. 3 generations of Mitchells worked this land. I raised cattle, mended fences in blizzards, and never once asked my son Caleb for help when times got hard. But that June afternoon, with 200 guests watching, Caleb walked up to me with his jaw clenched tight. His bride Jessica stood 20 feet away, her white dress catching the breeze, her eyes cold as January snow. She'd decided my royal blue dress was stealing attention from her big day. Caleb didn't pull me aside, didn't lower his voice. He looked at me like I was a stranger causing trouble and said I needed to go home, that Jessica didn't want me there anymore. I felt every pair of eyes on me as I walked to my truck, the keys to the ranch heavy around my neck on their silver chain. James gave me those keys the day we bought this place in 1987. 3 weeks before he died, he made me promise something that seemed strange at the time. Don't ever let anyone take this land from you, Sarah, not even our boy. Driving back alone on that dirt road, watching the wedding tents disappear in my rearview mirror, I finally understood what my husband had seen coming. If you want to know how a mother's love became a battle for survival, and how those old keys became my only weapon, hit that subscribe button. This story is just getting started. Was this chapter good for you? Should I continue to the next one? The call came 3 days after the wedding. Not an apology. Not even an acknowledgement of what happened. Caleb wanted to talk about the ranch. I was out feeding the horses when my phone rang. Dusty, my oldest mare, nuzzled my shoulder as I answered. My son's voice sounded different, businesslike, like he was calling a vendor instead of his mother. He wanted to meet, said it was important. Said Jessica had some ideas about the property that could benefit both of us. The way he emphasized both made my stomach drop. In 32 years of being his mother, I'd learned to read the spaces between his words. I agreed to dinner at the ranch house, spent the afternoon cooking his favorite meatloaf, the recipe my grandmother brought from Ohio in 1952. Set the table with the good china, the plates with the tiny blue flowers that James and I got as wedding gifts. I wanted to believe my son would come home, that whatever poison Jessica had dripped in his ear would wash away when he sat at our family table. They arrived in Jessica's white Mercedes, which looked ridiculous on our dirt road. She wore heels that sank into the gravel and a designer outfit that cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months. Caleb carried a leather folder, the kind lawyers use. The small talk lasted exactly 12 minutes. Then Jessica started walking around my living room like she was on a house tour, taking pictures with her phone. She commented on the exposed beams, the stone fireplace, the view of the mountains through the picture window. She used words like rustic charm and untapped potential while photographing my furniture like it was for sale. Caleb cleared his throat. He'd barely touched his meatloaf. Jessica sat back down, placing her manicured hand over his, and he launched into their pitch. They wanted to turn the ranch into an event venue. Weddings, corporate retreats, authentic Montana experiences for wealthy tourists from Bozeman and Billings. Jessica had already researched similar properties pulling in 6 figures a year. She showed me a Pinterest board on her phone, full of rustic chic venues with fairy lights and farm tables. My home, turned into a backdrop for strangers' Instagram photos. I asked where exactly I'd be living while my house became a wedding factory. Jessica smiled, like she'd been waiting for that question. They'd looked into some lovely senior communities in town. Independent living, she called it, with activities and people my own age. She made it sound like summer camp instead of exile. I looked at my son, waited for him to say something, anything, that sounded like the boy who used to help me deliver calves in the middle of the night, who cried when we buried his father under the cottonwood tree out back. But Caleb just nodded along, adding that the income would be good for my retirement, that I wouldn't have to work so hard anymore. Work. Like this ranch was a burden I'd been dying to escape instead of the life James and I built with our own hands. I told them no. Simple as that. This wasn't a property investment or a business opportunity. This was my home. The land James and I bought when Caleb was 2 years old, where we raised him, buried pets, celebrated every Christmas and birthday, where James took his last breath holding my hand. Jessica's smile finally cracked. She leaned forward and spoke in that patient tone people use with children or the elderly. She explained that I was getting older, living alone, managing too much property for one person. Wouldn't it be smarter to let the younger generation take over? Wasn't I tired? The thing is, I was tired. Tired of being treated like I was senile just because I had gray hair. Tired of watching my son transform into a stranger. Tired of this woman who'd been in our lives less than a year, acting like she owned the future. I stood up from the table, told them dinner was over. Caleb tried to argue, said I wasn't being reasonable, that I needed to think about his future, about their future. Jessica stood there with her arms crossed, her expression shifting from fake sympathy to cold calculation. As they left, Jessica turned at the door, said she hoped I'd reconsider before I forced them to explore other options. The threat was barely veiled. I watched their taillights disappear down the road, and my hand went to the keys around my neck. James had left me something besides those keys. A letter, locked in our safe, dated 2 weeks before he died. I'd only read it once, years ago, and filed it away as the paranoid thoughts of a dying man. That night, I pulled it out again. Sarah, if Caleb ever comes after this land, you stand your ground. I've seen something in him lately, an ambition that doesn't care who it hurts. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's the morphine talking. But if I'm right, you remember this. You earned this place. Don't let anyone make you feel small for protecting what's yours. My husband knew. Somehow, 15 years ago, dying in our bedroom, he saw exactly what was coming. 2 weeks of silence passed after that dinner. I spent the time doing what I always did, working. The ranch doesn't care about family drama. Cattle still need feeding. Fences still need mending. Irrigation systems still break at the worst possible times. But I also started gathering documents, every deed, every tax record, every piece of paper with the Mitchell name on it. I pulled boxes from the attic that hadn't been opened since James died. Inside, I found the original purchase agreement from 1987, the mortgage papers we burned in celebration when we made the final payment in 2001, surveys showing our exact property lines. I found something else too. A manila folder tucked inside one of James's old ledgers, labeled simply, Contingency. Inside were letters from a lawyer in Billings, dated from the year before James died. He'd been updating our estate plan, making sure everything was airtight. There were notes in his handwriting about trust structures, conservation easements, ways to protect the land even after we were gone. James had been preparing for this fight long before I understood there would be one. I was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by 15 years of paperwork, when I heard tires on gravel. Not Caleb's truck. A sedan I didn't recognize. 2 men in suits stepped out carrying briefcases. They knocked like they had every right to be there. Introduced themselves as representatives from Caleb and Jessica's legal team. They had papers for me to review. Documents outlining a property division arrangement, since Caleb was technically a co-owner of certain assets. Their words, not mine. I invited them in, made coffee, let them spread their papers across my dining table while I read every single word. They talked while I read, explaining how this could be simple and painless, how the courts often sided with younger family members in cases involving aging property owners, how expensive litigation could be for someone on a fixed income. The papers were impressive, I'll give them that. Lots of legal language about equitable distribution and modernization requirements and capable management. What they actually said was that I was too old to run this place properly, And my son deserved his inheritance now instead of waiting for me to die. There was a provision about my living arrangements. A generous offer, they called it. A condo in town, paid for, where I could live comfortably without the burden of property maintenance. In exchange, I'd sign over operational control and eventual ownership to Caleb and Jessica. The lawyers sat there smiling, confident they'd presented an offer I couldn't refuse. They probably did this all the time, helped entitled children take what they wanted from parents who were too worn down to fight back. I asked them to leave, didn't sign anything. They warned me that refusing could trigger a legal process nobody wanted, that families shouldn't fight in court, that I should think carefully about my relationship with my future grandchild. That last part hit like a fist to the stomach. I hadn't known Jessica was pregnant when they left after dinner. She must have told Caleb to use it as leverage. After the lawyers left, I sat alone in the quiet house and let myself cry for exactly 10 minutes. Then I dried my eyes, picked up the phone, and called the attorney whose name was on James's contingency folder. Margaret Reeves. She'd been practicing law in Billings for 40 years, and her voice on the phone sounded like gravel and whiskey. She remembered James, remembered setting up the protections he'd insisted on. She asked me one question. Are you ready to fight, or are you calling to surrender? I told her I was ready. She asked me to bring every document I had to her office. We spent 6 hours going through paperwork. She showed me things I'd forgotten signing, protections James had built into our estate that I didn't fully understand back then. The ranch wasn't just jointly owned. It was held in a specific kind of trust that required my approval for any major changes. Caleb had some rights, sure, but they weren't anywhere close to what his lawyers were claiming. Better yet, there was a clause James had insisted on. Any attempt to force a sale or operational change required proving I was legally incompetent. Not just old, not just tired, actually incapable of managing my own affairs. Margaret leaned back in her chair and smiled. She told me those lawyers had made a mistake by coming at me with threats before doing their homework. They'd tipped their hand, shown me exactly what they planned to do. Now we could prepare for it. I drove home that evening with a folder full of my own papers, my own legal strategies. The sunset painted the mountains pink and gold, the same view that had greeted me every evening for 38 years. My phone buzzed with a text from Caleb. Just 4 words. Mom, please be reasonable. I looked at the keys hanging from my rearview mirror, catching the last light of day. Reasonable. They wanted me to be reasonable while they stole my life out from under me. Jessica called me directly for the first time 3 days later. Her voice dripped with concern, asking if we could meet for lunch in town. Just us girls, she said, to clear the air without the men complicating things. I agreed. Curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see what approach she'd take without Caleb or lawyers as backup. We met at the Main Street Cafe, the same place where I'd been having coffee with friends for 20 years. Jessica arrived 15 minutes late, apologized breathlessly about traffic, though there's never traffic in our town. She wore casual clothes, trying to look approachable, but her purse probably cost more than my truck payment. She ordered a salad and mineral water, then launched into her speech. How sorry she was about the wedding, about how emotions ran high that day, how she never meant for things to get so tense. She reached across the table and touched my hand, her engagement ring glinting under the cafe lights. Then she talked about the baby, due in December, how excited Caleb was to be a father, how important it was for children to have stability, to grow up in a home where there wasn't constant conflict. She painted a picture of holiday gatherings and birthday parties, of me being grandma, if only we could find a way forward. The implication was crystal clear. Give them what they want, or lose access to your grandchild. I let her talk, nodded in appropriate places, played the role she expected, the lonely older woman desperate to stay connected to family. I asked questions about her pregnancy, about their plans, about where they were living now. She relaxed, thinking she'd found my weak spot. That's when she made her mistake. Jessica started talking about their vision for the ranch in detail, the the timeline they'd mapped out. How they already had investors interested in the event venue concept. How they'd connected with a developer who specialized in rural property conversions. She'd done market research, she said, pulling out her phone to show me spreadsheets and profit projections. She got so comfortable in her pitch that she forgot to maintain the pretense of caring about my feelings. Started talking about me in third person, about how we'd present my move to town as my choice, as me downsizing for health reasons. Better optics, she said. Cleaner narrative for when they took over. I asked her who exactly these investors were. She hesitated, realized she'd said too much, then tried to backtrack. But I pressed gently, still playing the confused older woman. And she gave me a name. Trevor Carlson, a real estate developer from Bozeman known for buying up ranch land and converting it into luxury subdivisions. Everything clicked into place. This wasn't about event venues or keeping the ranch in the family. Jessica had a buyer lined up. They'd run the venue story for a year, maybe 2, then sell to Carlson for triple what the land was worth as a working ranch. Caleb would get rich, I'd be in some apartment in town, and 3 generations of Mitchell history would be bulldozed for vacation homes. I excused myself to the bathroom, stood in front of the mirror, and took 3 deep breaths. When I came back to the table, I'd made my decision. I told Jessica I needed time to think, that I wanted to be part of my grandchild's life, that maybe she was right about me being tired. I watched her eyes light up, watched her think she'd won. We said goodbye in the parking lot. She hugged me, told me I was making the right choice for everyone. As she drove away in her Mercedes, I pulled out my phone and called Margaret. Within 2 hours, my attorney had researched Trevor Carlson, found 3 other properties where he'd done exactly what I suspected, worked with family members to push out elderly owners, made promises about preserving land, then subdivided and sold within 18 months. There were even lawsuits from 2 families who'd tried to fight back after realizing they'd been conned. Margaret asked if I wanted to confront Caleb with this information. I told her no. Not yet. Let them think I was weakening. Let Jessica believe her tears and baby talk had worked. Meanwhile, we'd strengthen every legal protection we had. That evening, sitting on my porch watching the sun set over the mountains, I thought about the boy Caleb used to be. The kid who cried when we had to sell cattle because of drought, who helped me scatter his father's ashes under the cottonwood tree, who promised at James's funeral that he'd always take care of me. Somewhere along the way, that boy had been replaced by a man I didn't recognize, a man who saw his mother as an obstacle instead of a person, who valued money over memory. My phone buzzed. Text from Caleb. Jessica said you 2 had a good talk. I'm glad you're coming around, Mom. I didn't respond, just sat there with my coffee, watching the stars come out, the same stars that had watched over this land for centuries before any Mitchell set foot here. They thought I was just a tired old woman ready to give up. They had no idea what a mother backed into a corner could do. Margaret called it defensive fortification. I called it making damn sure nobody could steal my home while I was still breathing. We spent the next 2 weeks building a legal wall around the ranch. Every morning I drove into Billings with another box of documents. Every evening I drove home with a better understanding of exactly what James had set up and why. The trust structure was brilliant. James had created something called a revocable living trust with specific succession requirements. On paper, Caleb was named as successor trustee, meaning he'd take over when I died. But there were conditions. He had to demonstrate active participation in ranch management for at least 5 consecutive years. He had to maintain the property as a working cattle operation, not commercial development. And most importantly, any changes to those terms required my signature while I was alive and competent. Jessica's lawyers had either missed these provisions or hoped I didn't know about them. Either way, their property division papers had been garbage from the start, but we didn't stop there. Margaret helped me add additional protections. We created a conservation easement with the Montana Land Trust, permanently restricting development on the majority of the acreage. It cut the property's value for subdivision purposes by 60% overnight. Trevor Carlson's investment opportunity just became a lot less attractive. We also updated my medical directives, naming Margaret as my healthcare power of attorney instead of Caleb. If anyone tried to claim I was incompetent, they'd have to go through a lawyer who'd fight them at every step. The whole process cost me $15,000, money I'd saved for emergencies, for new equipment, for the security of knowing I had something set aside. Watching that savings account drain hurt, but not as much as losing everything would. While I built legal walls, I also reached out to people. Not for sympathy, but for witnesses. I called Bill Henderson, who'd been buying cattle from me for 30 years. Asked him to document every transaction, every visit to the ranch, every conversation that showed I was managing the operation competently. He understood immediately, told me he'd seen this exact thing happen to his own mother before she died. I contacted my doctor, explained the situation, asked her to note in my records that I was mentally and physically capable of managing my affairs. She was furious on my behalf, offered to write a detailed assessment if needed. I even drove out to visit Dorothy Chang, who ran the feed store. She'd known James and me since we first bought the ranch. I asked her to keep records of our interactions, of the orders I placed, of the fact that I was still running a functional cattle operation. She hugged me and said she'd testify in court if it came to that. I was building a paper trail proving my competence, creating a record that would stand up against whatever lies Caleb and Jessica planned to tell. During those 2 weeks, Caleb called me 4 times. Each conversation was the same. He'd start friendly, asking how I was doing. Then he'd mention Jessica's pregnancy, drop hints about how nice it would be if we could resolve our differences before the baby came. He never directly mentioned the ranch, but it was always there, hanging between us like smoke. I played along, stayed polite, gave him nothing to use against me. Margaret had coached me. Every phone call could be recorded, every text saved as evidence. Don't get emotional, don't make threats, just be consistently reasonable and clear. The hardest part was the loneliness. I'd spent 15 years running this ranch alone after James died, and I'd been fine. But this was different. This was active isolation, knowing my only child was working against me, preparing to take everything I'd built. I'd sit at the kitchen table some nights, surrounded by legal documents, and wonder if I should just give up. Take the condo in town, let them have it. At least I'd still be in my son's life, still know my grandchild. Then I'd remember Jessica's face in that cafe, the calculations in her eyes when she talked about timelines and investors. I'd remember that this wasn't about family or legacy for them. It was about money. And if I gave in now, if I rewarded this cruelty, what message would I send to that unborn grandchild? That it's okay to manipulate people? That love comes with conditions? That elderly people are disposable when they're inconvenient? James used to say that principles only matter when standing by them costs you something. Sitting alone in our kitchen, I understood what he meant. By the end of those 2 weeks, we had it. A legal fortress, papers filed with the county, easements recorded, medical assessments documented, witnesses lined up. If Caleb and Jessica wanted to fight, they'd discover I wasn't some confused old woman they could steamroll. Margaret called me on a Friday evening with news. Caleb's lawyers had filed preliminary paperwork for a competency hearing. They were actually doing it, trying to have me declared incapable of managing my own affairs. The war I'd been preparing for had officially begun. The competency hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Margaret said that was good news, that it gave us time to prepare. It didn't feel like good news. It felt like waiting for an execution date. But something unexpected happened during those 6 weeks. Jessica's mask didn't just slip anymore. It shattered completely. It started with social media. She'd always been active online, posting perfectly filtered photos of her and Caleb, their apartment, her pregnancy journey. I didn't follow her accounts, but friends in town did, and they started telling me things. Jessica was complaining, not directly about me, but about Montana in general. Too small, too boring, too far from real culture. She posted photos of Bozeman cafes with captions about missing city life. She shared articles about rural property values, investment opportunities in developing areas. She wasn't even trying to hide the fact that this was all temporary for her. Caleb started looking different too. I'd see him in town occasionally, always from a distance. He'd lost weight, looked tired. One of my friends mentioned seeing them argue in the parking lot of the grocery store. Jessica's voice carrying across the lot while Caleb just stood there, shoulders hunched. Then I got a phone call from an unexpected source. Tom Bradley, who'd gone to high school with Caleb, ran a construction company in town. He told me Jessica had reached out to him about renovation estimates for the ranch, wanted to know costs for converting the barn into an event space, adding parking areas, building out guest accommodations. Tom had asked her when construction was starting, since he hadn't heard anything about permits or ownership transfers. Jessica had brushed him off, told him those were just formalities, that the property would be theirs soon enough. The certainty in her voice had bothered him enough that he called to warn me. I thanked him and added his statement to the growing file Margaret was building. But the real crack appeared 5 weeks before the hearing. I was at the feed store when I overheard 2 women talking. They didn't see me around the corner, didn't realize who I was. They were discussing Jessica's baby shower, planned for the following weekend at some trendy venue in Bozeman. One of them mentioned the registry, said Jessica had put luxury items on there, things that seemed excessive for a first baby. The other woman laughed and said of course she did, that Jessica had told someone at her yoga class that once they got the ranch money, she was moving them to Colorado. Better schools, better opportunities. Montana was just a stepping stone. I stood there in the feed aisle, holding a bag of mineral supplements, and finally had confirmation of what I'd suspected all along. This was never about Caleb wanting his inheritance or about building something on family land. This was about Jessica wanting money, and my son was too blinded by love or pride or whatever it was to see he was being used. I wanted to call him, wanted to shake him and ask when he'd become someone who'd betray his mother for a woman who saw him as a meal ticket. But Margaret had been clear. No direct contact that wasn't documented and carefully controlled. So instead, I did something else. I reached out to Caleb's old friends, people he'd grown up with, not to badmouth Jessica, but to ask them to check on him, to remind him who he used to be. Several of them called me back, concerned. They'd noticed the changes too, how he'd isolated himself, how he defended Jessica even when she insulted their town, their way of life. One of them, Marcus, told me something that broke my heart. He'd asked Caleb if he was sure about all this, about the legal action against me. Caleb had said yes, but then added something telling. I have to. I don't have a choice anymore. What did that mean? Was he in debt? Was Jessica controlling him? Or had he just gone so far down this road that turning back felt impossible? 3 weeks before the hearing, Jessica posted a photo on social media that went viral locally. She was standing in front of our ranch gate, her baby bump visible, with a caption about building her family's future on Montana land. The comments were mostly supportive, people who didn't know the backstory. But several locals recognized the ranch, knew what was happening, and called her out. The post disappeared within hours, but screenshots lived forever. Margaret added them to our file. Then, 2 weeks before the hearing, I got a letter. Not from lawyers, but from Caleb himself. Handwritten, shoved in my mailbox without a stamp. He asked me to drop the fight, said it didn't have to be this way. Said Jessica was stressed, the pregnancy was hard, and all this conflict wasn't good for the baby. He promised they'd take care of the ranch, honor Dad's memory, make sure I was comfortable. Every word was a lie wrapped in guilt, wrapped in manipulation. I wrote back. One sentence. Your father knew. That's why he made me promise. I left it in his mailbox, never got a response. The countdown to the hearing continued, each day heavier than the last. 1 week before the competency hearing, Margaret called me at 6 in the morning. Her voice had an edge I hadn't heard before. She told me to sit down, that we had a problem and an opportunity, and I needed to hear both. The problem: Caleb's legal team had gotten sophisticated. They'd hired a psychologist who specialized in elder competency evaluations. This doctor had submitted a preliminary report based on interviews with Caleb and Jessica, claiming I showed signs of cognitive decline, refusing reasonable offers, isolating myself, making financially irresponsible decisions like spending $15,000 on unnecessary legal fees. They were building a narrative that I was paranoid, declining, unable to recognize that I needed help. The event venue story had been dropped entirely. Now they claimed they just wanted to ensure I was cared for, that the ranch was too much for me to handle alone. I felt sick listening to Margaret read the report. They'd twisted everything. My strength became stubbornness. My independence became isolation. My fight to protect my home became evidence of impaired judgment. But then Margaret told me about the opportunity. Jessica had made a mistake. A big one. She'd been talking, and not just to yoga classes and construction contractors. She'd been reaching out to real estate developers, shopping the ranch around before they even had control of it. Trevor Carlson wasn't the only one. There were 3 other companies she'd contacted, all with paper trails, emails, contract proposals, marketing materials she'd prepared showing how the land could be subdivided. One of those developers had gotten nervous about the legal situation and contacted Margaret directly, wanting to make sure any deal was legitimate before investing. He'd handed over everything Jessica had sent him, worried about liability. Margaret had spent the last week tracking down the others. Built a case showing that Jessica's interest in the ranch had nothing to do with family or caring for me, and everything to do with a calculated plan to flip the property for profit. This evidence destroyed their narrative. You can't claim you're worried about an elderly woman's welfare while simultaneously shopping her property to developers behind her back. But we had to be strategic about using it. Margaret wanted to wait until the hearing, let them commit to their story under oath, then pull out the evidence, make them look like liars in front of a judge. I spent that week preparing my own testimony. Margaret coached me on what to expect. They'd ask about my daily routine, my ability to manage finances, my social connections. They'd look for any sign of confusion or decline. I needed to be sharp, clear, specific. We did practice sessions. Margaret played the role of their attorney, asking increasingly invasive questions. What medications was I on? Did I ever forget to pay bills? Had I gotten lost driving anywhere? Did I understand the value of my property? Why was I refusing help from my family? Some of the questions hurt, not because I couldn't answer them, but because they reduced my entire life to a competency checklist: 59 years of living, 38 years of marriage, 32 years of raising a child, 15 years of running a ranch alone. None of that mattered to the court. Only whether I could remember what I ate for breakfast and pay my electric bill on time. 3 days before the hearing, I had an unexpected visitor. Caleb's friend Marcus showed up at my door just after sunset. He looked uncomfortable, kept glancing back at his truck like he might bolt any second. He told me he'd tried to talk to Caleb again. Really tried. But Caleb shut down every conversation, said everyone was against him and Jessica, that nobody understood what they were trying to build. Marcus had finally asked him directly, was this about the ranch or about his marriage? Caleb had answered, "What's the difference?" Marcus thought I should know that, thought I should understand that Caleb had tied his entire sense of worth to proving Jessica right, to succeeding in this plan. Turning back now would mean admitting he'd betrayed his mother for nothing. The sunken cost of his choices had become too heavy to abandon. I thanked Marcus, asked him if he'd be willing to testify if needed. He said yes, without hesitation. After he left, I sat on the porch in the dark, thought about all the times I'd imagined becoming a grandmother. The baby clothes I'd planned to buy, the stories I'd tell, the way I'd teach a grandchild about this land, the same way James and I taught Caleb. None of that was going to happen now. Even if I won the hearing, even if I kept the ranch, I'd lost my son. That baby would grow up hearing some version of events where I was the villain who kept them from their inheritance. The weight of that loss sat on my chest like stone. But when the sun came up the next morning, I fed the horses, mended a section of fence that had come loose, and called Margaret to confirm I'd be ready. I'd already lost my son. I wasn't going to lose myself, too. The courthouse in Billings smelled like floor polish and old paper. I wore a simple blue blouse and slacks, my mother's pearl earrings. Margaret had coached me. Look put together, but not defensive. Show them a capable woman, not someone performing competence. Caleb and Jessica sat across the aisle with their attorneys. Jessica wore a cream-colored maternity dress, her hand resting protectively on her belly. The optics were deliberate. Concerned pregnant woman worried about unstable mother-in-law. Caleb wouldn't meet my eyes. The hearing started with their side. Their attorney painted me as isolated, deteriorating, refusing help from loving family members who only wanted to ensure my well-being. He brought up the $15,000 I'd spent on legal fees, suggested it was evidence of poor judgment. He referenced the psychologist's report, highlighting concerns about my emotional state and resistance to change. Then they called Caleb to testify. My son sat in that witness box and told careful, constructed lies. He said I'd become withdrawn after his father's death, that I'd refused his offers to help with ranch management, that I'd reacted irrationally to their reasonable suggestions about the property, that he was worried about my safety living alone at my age. He made it sound like love, like concern, like everything he was doing came from a good place. Jessica testified next. She cried, talked about how much she'd tried to build a relationship with me, how excited she was for me to be a grandmother, how heartbreaking it was to see me pushing family away. She said she understood that loss and aging could affect people's judgment, that she didn't blame me, that she just wanted me to be safe and cared for. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Hendricks, listened without expression, took notes, asked occasional clarifying questions. Then it was our turn. Margaret started by calling me to the stand. She asked me straightforward questions about my daily life. I described my routine: feeding livestock, maintaining equipment, managing finances, coordinating with the feed store and veterinarian. I provided specific examples, dates, numbers. I showed I knew exactly what was happening on my property and in my bank accounts. Then she asked about my relationship with Caleb. I told the truth, that I'd raised him to value family and integrity, that I'd worked alongside my husband to build something we could pass down, that when Caleb met Jessica, I'd welcomed her with open arms, that I only refused their proposals when I realized they planned to destroy everything James and I built. Margaret entered James's letter into evidence. The judge read it carefully, her expression shifting slightly. Then Margaret brought out the emails, the development proposals, the marketing materials Jessica had created. One by one, she laid out the evidence that this was never about my competence or my welfare. She called Trevor Carlson to testify remotely. He confirmed that Jessica had contacted him about purchasing the property, that she'd provided detailed information about the land, that she'd discussed timeline expectations for when they'd have control. She called the other developer who'd gotten nervous. He brought printed emails showing Jessica asking about valuation, about how quickly they could close a deal once the property was transferred. I watched Jessica's face drain of color, watched her lean over and whisper urgently to Caleb, who looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Their attorney tried to recover, suggested these were just casual inquiries, that exploring options wasn't evidence of bad intent. But Margaret was relentless. She showed how the timeline of these contacts aligned perfectly with their initial approaches to me, how Jessica had been planning this flip before they even asked me about the event venue idea. Then Margaret called Bill Henderson. He testified about 30 years of business with me, about transactions conducted just last month, about my clear and consistent competence in managing cattle sales. He brought receipts, records, documentation. She called my doctor, who stated plainly that I showed no signs of cognitive decline or impairment, that I was physically and mentally capable of managing my own affairs. The final witness was Marcus. He testified about Caleb's own words, about how this was tied to his marriage, about the pressure and changes in his personality since meeting Jessica. Judge Hendricks called for a 30-minute recess. We sat in the hallway, Margaret confident, me just trying to breathe. Across the hall, I could hear Jessica's raised voice, Caleb's quieter responses, their attorneys looking increasingly uncomfortable. When we returned, Judge Hendricks delivered her ruling from the bench. She said she'd seen enough evidence to conclude that I was fully competent to manage my affairs, that the petition for guardianship was denied, that the evidence suggested ulterior motives from the petitioners that had nothing to do with my welfare. She didn't stop there. She ordered Caleb and Jessica to pay my legal fees. She noted that the conservation easement I'd established was valid and enforceable. She strongly suggested they consider the consequences of continuing legal action that appeared to be based on financial gain rather than family concern. It was over. I'd won. But when I looked across the courtroom at my son, his head in his hands, while Jessica gathered her things with tight, angry movements, victory felt hollow. I'd kept my home. I'd protected James's legacy. But I'd lost my boy. The months after the hearing were quiet in ways that hurt. I won the legal battle, but the silence from Caleb was its own kind of defeat. Jessica left him 6 weeks after Judge Hendricks' ruling. Turned out the ranch money wasn't the only thing she was after. Marcus heard through mutual friends that she'd reconnected with an ex-boyfriend in Denver, a real estate broker with family money. She filed for divorce while 7 months pregnant, citing irreconcilable differences. Colorado had different custody laws, and Jessica used them to her advantage. Caleb got visitation rights, but the baby, a girl named Emma, would be raised in Denver. He'd become a part-time father to a daughter he'd destroyed his family trying to provide for. The apartment he and Jessica had rented was too expensive on his salary alone. He moved back to Montana, but not to the ranch. He got a place in town, started working construction with Tom Bradley's company. Tom told me later that Caleb was a good worker, showed up on time, kept his head down. Didn't talk much about his personal life. I saw him occasionally. Town isn't big enough to avoid someone forever. We'd pass each other at the grocery store or the gas station. He'd nod. I'd nod back. Neither of us knew how to bridge the canyon we'd carved between us. Bill Henderson told me something 6 months after the hearing. He'd run into Caleb at the feed store. And Caleb had asked how I was doing, not in a legal sense or a hostile sense, just asked if I was okay. Bill said Caleb looked like he wanted to ask more but didn't know how. I thought about that for a long time, wondered if my son was finally seeing clearly what he'd done, what he'd lost. Wondered if Jessica leaving had broken whatever spell she'd cast over his judgment. The ranch thrived that year. The conservation easement brought me some tax benefits I hadn't expected. I hired a young couple, newcomers to Montana, to help with the heavy work. They lived in the old foreman's cottage that had been empty since James died. Having people around again felt good. I started attending Cattle Ranchers Association meetings, something I'd let slide over the years. Made some new friends, reconnected with old ones, learned that my situation wasn't unique. Several other older ranchers shared stories of family members who'd gotten greedy, who'd tried to push them out. We formed an informal support network, sharing legal resources and strategies. Dorothy Chang from the feed store invited me to join her book club. I hadn't read anything but veterinary journals in years. Sitting around Dorothy's living room with 5 other women, drinking wine and arguing about whether the protagonist in our current novel was justified in her choices, felt like discovering a part of myself I'd forgotten existed. On Emma's first birthday, I sent a gift to Jessica's address in Denver. A handmade quilt, the pattern my mother taught me when I was young. I included a note saying I hoped Emma was healthy and happy. I didn't expect a response and didn't get one. But I needed to do it anyway. Needed to acknowledge that little girl's existence, even if I'd never meet her. 2 years after the hearing, on a cold November morning, I found a letter in my mailbox. Caleb's handwriting, no return address. Inside was a single page, dated the previous night. He wrote that he'd been wrong, not just about the ranch, but about everything. He'd let ambition and pride and a woman he barely knew convince him to betray the person who'd loved him longest. He said he understood if I never forgave him that he probably didn't deserve forgiveness. But he wanted me to know that he was sorry, that he thought about it every day, that he'd been visiting Dad's grave, trying to explain himself to a man who wasn't there to hear it. He didn't ask for anything, didn't request money or reconciliation or access to the ranch, just said he was sorry and that he hoped I was doing okay. I read that letter 3 times sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd sat with his lawyers and his pregnant wife, trying to take my home. The same table where James and I had celebrated every milestone of his childhood. I thought about all the advice people had given me over the past 2 years. Some said I should let him back in, that family was family. Others said he'd made his choice and I should protect myself. Everyone had an opinion about what I should do. But sitting there in the quiet house, I realized this decision wasn't about should. It was about could. Could I find a path toward forgiveness that didn't erase what happened but acknowledge that people could change? Could my son and I ever rebuild something new from the rubble of what we'd destroyed? I didn't have those answers yet. Maybe I wouldn't for a while. But I picked up a pen and started writing back. Not forgiveness, not yet. But acknowledgement. The first word in a conversation that might take years to complete. Outside my window, the Montana sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. The same mountains that had watched over 3 generations of Mitchells. The same land that had taught me both how to fight and how to heal. I was 59 years old. I'd survived betrayal, won impossible battles, lost what I thought I couldn't live without, and discovered I was stronger than I'd known. The ranch was mine, the future was uncertain, and somewhere in Denver, a little girl named Emma was growing up who might someday want to know her grandmother's story. This wasn't the ending I'd imagined standing in that wedding garden 2 years ago, but it was an ending I could live with. More importantly, it was a beginning I could build on. I hope my story reminded you that dignity isn't given, it's claimed. That age brings wisdom, not weakness, and that some battles, no matter how painful, are worth fighting because they define who we are when everything else falls away. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let me know. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you of your own battles or your own strength, hit that subscribe button. Sometimes we all need to be reminded that we're not alone in the fight. Until next time, may your roots run deep and your resolve run deeper.